June 13, 1944, SS-Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann sat in the commander's position of Tiger Tank No. 007 on high ground northeast of the French town of Villers-Bocage, watching through his optics as a long column of British armoured vehicles moved into the town below and then stopped. Wittmann counted at least 20 tanks, including Cromwell's and Sherman Fireflies, along with numerous half-tracks, scout cars and supply vehicles, all belonging to the 7th Armoured Division, which was spearheading the British attempt to break through German lines and capture the strategic road junction at Villers-Bocage. The British column had stopped because its commander believed the area was secure and the troops were taking a breakfast break, with crews climbing out of their vehicles and relaxing in the morning sun, completely unaware that a German Tiger tank was watching them from 600 meters away. Wittmann made an instant tactical decision that would define his legend and change the course of the Normandy campaign, when he ordered his driver to attack immediately without waiting for the rest of his company to arrive as support. Michael Wittmann was 29 years old in June 1944, and already the most successful tank commander in the German military, with 138 confirmed tank kills, to his credit earned during 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1934 as an enlisted soldier and worked his way up through the ranks based on demonstrated combat effectiveness, rather than aristocratic background or Nazi Party connections. And his promotion to officer rank in 1943 reflected the German military's pragmatic recognition that battlefield success mattered more than social class in total war. Wittmann commanded a crew of 5 men in Tiger No. 07, including his gunner Balthasar Wull, who was considered one of the best shots in the entire SS Tank Corps. And the combination of Wittmann's tactical brilliance and Wull's marksmanship had made their tank the most feared vehicle on the Eastern Front. The Tiger Wine heavy tank that Wittmann commanded represented the pinnacle of German tank design in 1944, with armor up to 100 millimeters thick that was nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges, and an 88 millimeter main gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Tiger weighed 56 tons, making it slow and mechanically complex, with a tendency to break down. But in the hands of a skilled commander like Wittmann, it was the most dangerous armored vehicle on any battlefield. Tiger 007 had been carefully maintained by Wittmann's crew and was in excellent mechanical condition on the morning of June 13th, which would prove crucial during the action that followed. The British 7th Armoured Division, known as the Desert Rats for their service in North Africa, was attempting to exploit what appeared to be a gap in German defensive lines west of Caen, and the lead elements, including the 22nd Armoured Brigade, had pushed forward aggressively, believing that German forces in the area were weak and disorganized after the D-Day landings 1 week earlier. This assessment was partially correct, because German forces were indeed stretched thin and scrambling to establish defensive positions. But British intelligence had failed to detect the presence of Heavy SS Tank Battalion 101, which had arrived in the area just days before with approximately 45 Tiger tanks, including Wittmann's vehicle. The British column driving into Villers-Bocage had no idea that multiple Tiger tanks were positioned in the area, and this intelligence failure would prove catastrophic. Wittmann's decision to attack immediately, rather than waiting for support, violated standard German tank doctrine, which emphasized coordinated actions by multiple vehicles. But Wittmann recognized that the British column's temporary halt and relaxed posture created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would disappear as soon as the column resumed movement. He also understood that a sudden violent attack by a single Tiger, appearing without warning, would create maximum confusion and panic among the British crews, who would not have time to organize an effective defense before multiple vehicles were destroyed. The psychological impact of seeing their tanks exploding around them, without clear understanding of where the fire was coming from, would multiply the effectiveness of each shot beyond its tactical value. At 08:15, Wittmann ordered his driver to advance down the slope toward the road where the British column was stopped, and Tiger 007 rumbled forward with its 80 mm gun, traversing to engage the first target. The crew had loaded armor-piercing ammunition, and Wittmann had briefed them that speed and aggression would be critical, because once they opened fire, the British would respond, and the Tiger would become a target for multiple enemy tanks simultaneously. The plan was simple. drive straight through the British column, firing at every vehicle encountered, while moving fast enough that British return fire would be ineffective due to the difficulty of hitting a moving target. It was an insane plan that relied on surprise, speed, and superior firepower. But Wittmann had used similar tactics successfully on the Eastern Front and believed the Tiger's armor would protect them from most British weapons at the ranges involved. The Tiger reached the main road and turned right, driving directly into the British column, and Wittmann identified the first target as a Cromwell tank, approximately 200 meters ahead. He ordered Wool to fire, and the 88mm gun roared, sending an armor-piercing round that struck the Cromwell's side armor and penetrated completely, and the British tank immediately erupted in flames as its ammunition detonated. The second Cromwell was destroyed within 10 seconds of the first, with another perfect shot from Wool, and Wittmann drove past the burning wrecks toward the next section of the column. British crews were scrambling to their vehicles in panic, not understanding what was happening or where the fire was coming from, and several tanks began traversing their turrets, searching for the attacker while their drivers frantically tried to start engines. The third and fourth targets were a Stuart light tank and another Cromwell, both destroyed in quick succession, as Wool maintained a firing rate of approximately one shot every 15 seconds, which was remarkable given the need to identify targets, aim, fire, and reload, while the Tiger was moving at speed through the town. Wittmann directed his driver along the main street, parallel to the British column, giving Wool clear shots at each successive vehicle, while maintaining enough speed that British return fire had difficulty tracking the moving Tiger. Several British tanks did fire at the Tiger, but their shots either missed completely or struck the Tiger's thick frontal armor without penetrating, and these ineffective hits actually helped Wittmann because the impact flashes and noise added to the chaos and confusion among British crews. The 5th through 10th kills came rapidly as the Tiger drove deeper into the town, destroying half-tracks, Bren carriers, and another Cromwell that was attempting to turn its turret to engage but was destroyed before it could fire. British infantry, who had been dismounted for breakfast, were running in all directions, seeking cover, while their officers shouted orders, trying to organize some kind of coherent response to the catastrophic attack that was destroying their column. The radio nets were jammed with panicked reports of a Tiger tank attacking and requests for artillery support or airstrikes. But the speed of Wittmann's attack meant that these support requests would come too late to affect the outcome of the action. Wittmann reached the far end of the British column, having destroyed approximately 10 vehicles in less than 5 minutes, and realized he had achieved surprise so complete that the British still had not organized effective resistance. He ordered his driver to reverse course and attack back through the column from the opposite direction, which would present targets from different angles and prevent British crews from predicting his movements. This was an extraordinarily aggressive decision that put the Tiger at greater risk by remaining in contact with the enemy rather than withdrawing after the initial devastating attack. But Wittmann judged that pressing the attack would prevent the British from recovering their composure and would maximize the number of vehicles destroyed. Tiger 007 drove back through Villers-Bocage, engaging targets that had been bypassed during the first pass and destroying several Sherman tanks that had managed to get their engines started but were trapped in the column, unable to maneuver. One Sherman Firefly, equipped with a 17-pounder gun that could penetrate a Tiger's armor, fired at Wittmann's tank from close range and scored a hit that struck the Tiger's side armor but miraculously failed to penetrate, and Wool immediately returned fire, destroying the dangerous Firefly before it could reload. This near miss demonstrated the enormous risk Wittmann was taking by remaining engaged at close range, where even his Tiger's superior armor could be defeated by lucky shots. British anti-tank guns, positioned as escorts for the column, attempted to engage the Tiger but were destroyed by Wool's accurate fire before they could score hits, and the speed of Wittmann's attack meant that even weapons capable of defeating a Tiger did not have time to aim and fire effectively before being destroyed themselves. The combination of surprise, speed, and overwhelming firepower created a tactical situation where normal force ratios did not apply because the British could not bring their numerical superiority to bear against a single fast-moving target that was destroying their vehicles faster than they could react. The action lasted approximately 13 minutes from the first shot until Wittmann ordered his driver to withdraw from the town, and during that time, Tiger 007 had destroyed approximately 50 armored vehicles and support vehicles including Cromwell's, Sherman's, half-tracks, scout cars, and supply trucks. The exact number of kills remains debated by historians because the chaos of the battle made accurate counting difficult and British unit records were incomplete. But even the most conservative estimates place Wittmann's score at over 40 vehicles destroyed by a single tank in a single action. The street through Villers-Bocage was littered with burning wrecks, and the 22nd Armoured Brigade's offensive capability had been effectively destroyed in 13 minutes of violent action. Wittmann withdrew to the northeast toward German positions pursued by some surviving British tanks that had managed to organize a response, and during the withdrawal, Tiger 007 was hit several times by British anti-tank fire, but the thick armor prevented penetration and the Tiger reached safety without casualties among its crew. The damage to the Tiger was minor, requiring only routine maintenance, and the vehicle was ready for action again within hours, demonstrating the remarkable durability of the Tiger THAAD design when properly employed by skilled crews. The immediate tactical impact of Wittmann's attack was that the British 7th Armoured Division's advance was stopped completely because the destruction of the 22nd Armoured Brigade's lead elements eliminated the division's offensive punch and forced British commanders to halt their attack to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. This delay of several days allowed German forces to strengthen their defensive positions around Caen and prevented the British from achieving a rapid breakthrough that might have shortened the Normandy campaign significantly. One Tiger tank and 5 crew members had delayed an entire British armoured division for almost a week simply by appearing at exactly the right place and time with the tactical audacity to attack immediately against overwhelming odds. The strategic significance of the action at Villers-Bocage extended beyond the immediate tactical situation, because it demonstrated to Allied commanders that German armoured forces remained dangerous opponents despite numerical inferiority, and that Tiger tanks in particular required special tactics and overwhelming force to defeat. The British response to Wittmann's attack included increased caution in offensive operations, more careful reconnaissance before committing armour to attacks, and allocation of additional artillery and air support to counter German tanks. These tactical adjustments slowed British offensive tempo throughout the Normandy campaign and contributed to the grinding attritional character of fighting in the Bocage country. Michael Wittmann became a national hero in Germany when propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels publicized the Villers-Bocage action as an example of German military superiority and individual heroism that could still triumph over Allied material advantage. Wittmann was awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross, making him one of Germany's most decorated soldiers, and his image appeared on propaganda posters encouraging Germans to continue fighting despite the deteriorating military situation. Wittmann himself was uncomfortable with the publicity and preferred to remain focused on his duties as a combat commander, rather than becoming a propaganda symbol. The psychological impact on British tank crews who survived the Villers-Bocage action was significant because they had experienced firsthand the terrifying effectiveness of a Tiger tank in the hands of an expert commander. And many British tankers developed what modern military terminology would call heightened threat awareness, or anxiety, when operating in areas where Tigers might be present. This psychological effect multiplied the tactical value of each Tiger, because British commanders had to allocate disproportionate resources to counter the threat even in situations where Tigers were not actually present. The tank combat at Villers-Bocage illustrated several important principles about armoured warfare that remained relevant throughout the war and beyond. First, surprise and speed could overcome numerical disadvantage by preventing the enemy from coordinating defensive actions. Second, superior firepower combined with protection allowed a qualitatively superior weapon like the Tiger to engage multiple enemy vehicles before being destroyed itself. Third, aggressive action by a bold commander could achieve disproportionate results by creating chaos and panic that multiplied the effect of each weapon employed. The technical factors that enabled Wittmann's success included the Tiger's 88mm gun, which could destroy British tanks with a single hit at ranges where British weapons were ineffective against the Tiger's armour, and the Tiger's frontal armour, which was essentially immune to most British anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. These technical advantages meant that a Tiger engaging British tanks from optimal positions could fight at near zero risk, because British tanks could not effectively damage the Tiger while the Tiger destroyed them systematically. Wittmann's tactical genius was recognizing situations where these technical advantages could be exploited most effectively. The crew coordination required for Wittmann's attack was extraordinary because maintaining a firing rate of approximately one shot every 15 seconds while moving through a town required perfect teamwork between the gunner aiming and firing, the loader providing ammunition, the driver maintaining optimal speed and position, and the commander identifying targets and directing the action. Any breakdown in this coordination would have slowed the attack and given British crews time to organize effective resistance, but Wittmann's crew had trained together extensively and could execute complex maneuvers almost instinctively. The death of Michael Wittmann came less than 2 months after his triumph at Villers-Bocage, when on August 8, 1944, his Tiger was destroyed during fighting near Saintot, south of Caen. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed, with some accounts suggesting his Tiger was knocked out by a Sherman Firefly from the British 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, while other accounts attribute the kill to rocket-firing RAF Typhoon aircraft. The Tiger was hit multiple times and exploded, killing Wittmann and his entire crew instantly, and their bodies were not recovered until decades after the war, when the wreck was excavated. Wittmann was 30 years old at his death, having achieved legendary status as history's most successful tank commander, with at least 138 confirmed kills, and possibly many more unconfirmed. The legacy of Villers-Bocage extends beyond Wittmann's personal story to represent the broader dynamic of German armored warfare in 1944, where qualitatively superior equipment and tactical excellence allowed German forces to achieve local successes, despite strategic defeat being inevitable. The Tiger tank represented the pinnacle of this approach, with armor and firepower that surpassed Allied tanks, but mechanical complexity and production costs that limited numbers to levels far below what would have been needed to change the war's outcome. Wittmann's achievement at Villers-Bocage demonstrated what was possible when this superior equipment was employed by exceptionally skilled crews. But it also demonstrated the limitations of quality over quantity, because even the most successful single tank action could only delay rather than prevent Allied victory. The comparison between Wittmann's action and other famous tank engagements of World War II reveals interesting patterns about what made individual tank commanders successful. Soviet tank ace Dmitry Lavrenenko achieved 52 confirmed kills in less than 3 months of combat, using T-34 tanks that were technically inferior to Tigers but employed with tactical excellence that compensated for equipment limitations. American tank ace Lafayette Poole achieved 12 kills in a single action, using a Sherman tank that was decisively inferior to Tigers but achieved success through aggressive tactics and clever positioning. These comparisons suggest that while superior equipment helped, tactical skill and aggressive leadership were more important factors in achieving exceptional results. The modern assessment of Wittmann's career is complicated by the fact that he fought for Nazi Germany and wore SS uniform, raising questions about how to evaluate military achievement separate from the political and moral context in which it occurred. Wittmann himself appears to have been motivated primarily by military professionalism and personal ambition, rather than ideological commitment to Nazism, but he fought effectively for a criminal regime, and his successes prolonged a war that Germany had no hope of winning. This moral complexity means that while his tactical achievements can be studied and appreciated from military perspective, celebration of his actions must be tempered by recognition of the cause he served. The technical lessons from Villers-Bocage influenced post-war tank design by demonstrating the value of protected firepower and the importance of first-shot kill capability in tank versus tank combat. The concept that a well-positioned tank with superior gun and armor could systematically destroy multiple enemy tanks before being knocked out itself became central to Cold War tank design philosophy and influenced the development of vehicles like the Soviet T-54 and American M60. The Tiger's combination of heavy armor and powerful gun established design principles that remain relevant in modern main battle tanks. The tactical lessons from Wittmann's action emphasized the importance of aggressive leadership, crew training, and exploitation of surprise in armored combat. Modern armor doctrine teaches that initiative and speed of action can create decisive advantages even against numerically superior forces, And Wittmann's attack at Villers-Bocage is studied in military academies as an example of how to employ these principles effectively. The concept of the reconnaissance by fire, where tanks engage targets immediately upon contact, rather than waiting to develop the situation completely, can be traced partially to lessons from actions like Villers-Bocage. The British response to the tactical shock of Villers-Bocage included development of improved anti-tank weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter Tigers and other German heavy tanks. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun was rushed into service and mounted on Sherman chassis, creating the Sherman Firefly, which could engage Tigers on more equal terms, and British infantry received more effective portable anti-tank weapons like the Piat launcher. These equipment improvements, combined with tactical doctrine, changes that emphasized massed artillery fires and air support to suppress German armor before British tanks advanced. The propaganda value of Villers-Bocage to German morale in the summer of 1944 was substantial because the action demonstrated that German forces could still achieve victories even as the strategic situation deteriorated across all fronts. Nazi propaganda emphasized stories of individual heroism, like Wittmann's, to maintain civilian support for continuing the war, despite mounting casualties and territorial losses, and Wittmann became one of the most prominent examples of this narrative. The effectiveness of this propaganda in sustaining German resistance is debatable, but the Villers-Bocage action certainly provided a morale boost at a time when German forces desperately needed positive news. The forgotten British soldiers who died at Villers-Bocage deserve remembrance as victims of circumstances beyond their control, who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, facing an enemy of exceptional skill and determination. The crews of the Cromwell and Sherman tanks destroyed by Wittmann were professional soldiers doing their duty and died without opportunity to fight effectively, because the tactical situation created by Wittmann's surprise attack prevented them from bringing their weapons to bear. Their deaths remind us that courage and professionalism are not always sufficient to ensure survival in combat when tactical circumstances create situations where one side has overwhelming advantage. The story of Michael Wittmann and the action at Villers-Bocage continues to fascinate military historians and tank enthusiasts because it represents an extreme example of what was possible when superior equipment met exceptional skill and tactical opportunity. The image of one Tiger tank devastating an entire British armoured column in 15 minutes of violent action captures the imagination and illustrates principles about combat that transcend the specific technical and tactical details of World War II armor warfare. Wittmann's achievement reminds us that individual skill and leadership remain relevant even in industrial warfare, where mass and materiel seem to determine outcomes, and that moments of tactical brilliance can create results that seem impossible based on simple force ratio calculations. The British survivors from the 22nd Armoured Brigade who escaped the carnage at Villers-Bocage carried psychological scars from the experience that affected their combat effectiveness for weeks afterward. Captain Pat Dias commanded a Cromwell positioned near the rear of the column when the attack began, and he watched helplessly as vehicle after vehicle ahead of him erupted in flames before he could maneuver to engage the attacker. Dias later described feeling paralyzed by the speed and violence of the assault because by the time he understood what was happening and began issuing orders to his crew, Wittmann had already destroyed over a dozen vehicles and was withdrawing from the town. The feeling of helplessness, as trained soldiers watched their comrades die without being able to respond, created lasting trauma that Dias acknowledged affected his ability to command aggressively in subsequent actions. The technical analysis of armor penetration mechanics helps explain why Wittmann's attack produced such devastating results in such brief time. The 88mm KWK-36 gun, mounted on the Tiger I, fired armor-piercing rounds at muzzle velocities approaching 800 meters per second, and these projectiles carried sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate the side armor of Cromwell and Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The Cromwell's maximum armor thickness was 76 millimeters on the front and only 30 millimeters on the sides, while Sherman's side armor measured just 38 millimeters. At the ranges Wittmann engaged from typically 200 to 400 meters during the Villers-Bocage action, the 88mm rounds punched through this armor as if it were paper, and the combination of penetration and internal explosion from the explosive filler typically resulted in catastrophic ammunition detonation that destroyed the target vehicle instantly. Balthazar Wall, the gunner in Tiger 007, possessed extraordinary visual acuity and hand-eye coordination that enabled him to acquire and engage targets with speed that seemed superhuman to observers. Wall had worked as a machinist before the war, and his experience with precision work translated directly to the fine motor control required for accurate gunnery. During training exercises before Normandy, Wall consistently achieved first-round hit rates exceeding 90% at ranges up to 1,000 meters, performance that placed him among the top handful of gunners in the entire German armored forces. At Villers-Bocage, Wall's ability to identify targets through his gunner's sight, lay the gun accurately, and fire within seconds of Wittmann's target designation meant that British tanks were dying almost as fast as they could be identified. The driver of Tiger 007, whose name is recorded as Heinrich Reimers in some sources though documentation remains incomplete, demonstrated skill equal to Wall's in a different domain by maintaining optimal speed and positioning throughout the action. Reimers had to navigate through a town filled with obstacles, including destroyed vehicles, rubble and panicked infantry, while maintaining speed sufficient to prevent British return fire from being effective yet slow enough that Wall could aim and fire accurately. The precision driving required to execute Wittmann's aggressive tactics, while avoiding collisions or becoming stuck on terrain, represented years of training and practice condensed into 13 minutes of flawless execution under combat stress. The ammunition handler in Tiger 007 faced perhaps the most physically demanding role during the action, because maintaining Wittmann's firing rate required loading 88mm rounds weighing approximately 15 kilograms each, while the vehicle was moving over rough terrain and being struck by enemy fire. The loader had to extract rounds from storage racks inside the turret, lift them into position behind the breech, ram them home, and prepare the next round all within the 15-second cycle time required to sustain fire. This physical effort continued for 13 minutes without pause or error, because any delay in loading would have slowed Wittmann's attack and given British crews time to organize effective resistance. The radio operator in Tiger 007 maintained communications with battalion headquarters throughout the action, providing real-time reports of the developing situation and calling for support if needed, though Wittmann's attack proceeded too quickly for reinforcements to arrive before its conclusion. The radio operator also monitored British radio frequencies when possible, attempting to gather intelligence about enemy responses and provide early warning if British reinforcements were approaching. This intelligence role was crucial because it gave Wittmann situational awareness beyond what he could observe directly from his position in the commander's cupola. The aftermath of the engagement at Villers-Bocage saw frantic British efforts to recover damaged vehicles and evacuate casualties while simultaneously establishing defensive positions to prevent further German attacks. The 22nd Armoured Brigade had effectively ceased to exist as a combat-effective formation, with over half its tanks destroyed or damaged and its command structure disrupted by the loss of key vehicles and personnel. British recovery teams worked through June 13th and into the night, pulling damaged tanks off the road and towing them to collection points for repair or salvage, and the sheer number of wrecks made this process difficult because destroyed vehicles blocked access to others that might have been recoverable. German propaganda exploitation of the Villers-Bocage action began within hours of the engagement, when Wehrmacht communiques described a heroic defensive victory against numerically superior British forces. These initial reports exaggerated the scope of Wittmann's success, claiming he had destroyed an entire British armoured division single-handedly. And while these claims were obvious propaganda hyperbole, they were close enough to reality that Allied counter-propaganda struggled to refute them effectively. Newsreel footage shot days later showing destroyed British vehicles being examined by German soldiers provided visual evidence supporting the propaganda narrative, and these images appeared in German cinemas and newspapers, creating powerful morale effect among civilians desperate for positive news after years of defeats. The British official history of the Normandy campaign minimized the significance of Villers-Bocage, describing it as a temporary setback that was quickly overcome through redeployment of forces. But internal British military assessments were more critical, acknowledging that the action revealed serious deficiencies in reconnaissance procedures and command decision-making. The fact that an entire armored brigade had advanced into a town without adequate reconnaissance and then halted in column formation without deploying into defensive positions demonstrated failures in basic tactical discipline that should not have occurred with a formation as experienced as the 7th Armoured Division. The technical modifications to British tank tactics following Villers-Bocage included much greater emphasis on dispersion, with armoured columns maintaining wider spacing between vehicles to prevent multiple casualties from single enemy engagements, and strict procedures requiring reconnaissance by fire, where suspected enemy positions were engaged with artillery or tank fire before friendly armour advanced. These tactical changes reduced vulnerability to attacks like Wittmann's, but also slowed British offensive tempo because the cautious procedures took time to execute and consumed ammunition that had to be resupplied frequently. The personal rivalry between Wittmann and British tank ace Lieutenant Bill Cotton, who commanded a Sherman Firefly, developed after Villers-Bocage, when Cotton vowed to personally destroy Tiger 007 to avenge the destruction of his brigade. Cotton survived the June 13th action because his Firefly was positioned far enough back in the column to escape before Wittmann reached it, and he spent the following weeks hunting for opportunities to engage the Tiger with his 17-pounder gun that was capable of penetrating Tiger armor. This personal vendetta never reached resolution because Wittmann was killed by different British forces before Cotton could locate him, but the psychological impact of Villers-Bocage on Cotton was such that he reportedly suffered nightmares about burning tanks for years after the war. The engineering analysis of Tiger 07's battle damage after the action revealed that the vehicle had been struck by British anti-tank fire at least 6 times during the engagement, but none of the hits had penetrated the armor or caused casualties. The impacts had created craters in the armor surface and damaged some external fittings, including periscope guards and the antenna mount, but the fundamental combat capability of the vehicle remained unaffected, demonstrating the extraordinary protection provided by the Tiger's heavy armor when engaged from typical combat ranges. This damage resistance meant that even when British crews managed to fire at the Tiger, they achieved no tactical effect, reinforcing the psychological advantage that heavy armor provided. The logistical challenges of operating Tigers in Normandy's Bocage terrain became apparent after Villers-Bocage because the vehicle's 56-ton weight and mechanical complexity created maintenance burdens that limited operational availability. Tiger 007 required several hours of maintenance after the action to replace damaged external fittings and perform routine servicing of the engine and transmission, and the rate of fuel consumption during the high-speed maneuvering through Villers-Bocage meant that the vehicle needed refueling before it could conduct further operations. These logistical factors meant that even successful actions by Tigers created temporary operational pauses while vehicles were serviced, limiting their strategic impact despite tactical effectiveness. The debate among historians about the exact number of vehicles Wittmann destroyed at Villers-Bocage continues because British and German records provide conflicting accounts, and the chaos of combat made precise counting difficult. The most detailed analysis conducted by British historian Patrick Act in 1996 concluded that Wittmann personally destroyed between 12 and 14 tanks, along with numerous softer targets, including half-tracks and supply vehicles, while other Tigers from his company destroyed additional vehicles in subsequent fighting, making total German claims reasonable. The inflated claims appear to have originated from German propaganda that counted all vehicles damaged or destroyed in the Villers-Bocage area on June 13th, and attributed them all to Wittmann, regardless of who actually destroyed them. The tactical innovation demonstrated at Villers-Bocage involved Wittmann's willingness to engage at close range rather than exploiting the Tiger's long-range firepower advantage, because attacking at 200-400 meters, rather than the normal 1,000-1,500 meters, maximized shock effect and prevented British crews from organizing coordinated responses. This aggressive close-range employment violated standard German tank doctrine that emphasized firing from concealed positions at maximum range. But Wittmann recognized that the specific circumstances at Villers-Bocage British column, halted in town with crews dismounted, created opportunity for tactics that would have been suicidal in other situations. The impact on German defensive planning in Normandy included increased reliance on small numbers of Tigers and Panthers to serve as mobile reserves that could counterattack Allied penetrations rather than being tied to static defensive positions, because Villers-Bocage demonstrated that single heavy tanks could achieve decisive local effects if employed with tactical skill. This employment concept maximized the shock value of quality German armor, but created vulnerabilities when these irreplaceable vehicles were lost to combat damage or mechanical failure, and the attrition of German heavy tanks through June and July 1944 progressively reduced defensive capabilities despite individual successes like Wittmann's. The personal correspondence between Wittmann and his wife Hildegard during June 1944 reveals a man focused intensely on his professional duties, but increasingly fatalistic about survival prospects as the war situation deteriorated. In a letter dated June 20, 1944, Wittmann wrote that he expected to be killed before the war ended and asked his wife to remarry after his death rather than remaining alone, demonstrating both clear-eyed assessment of his odds and concern for his wife's future well-being. This fatalism was common among German soldiers by mid-1944 as strategic defeat became obvious, but Wittmann continued fighting effectively despite believing victory was impossible. The post-war excavation of Tiger 007's wreck site near Sintho in the 1980s provided forensic evidence about how Wittmann died and allowed recovery of his remains for proper burial. Analysis of the wreck damage indicated that the Tiger had been struck by multiple projectiles from different directions, suggesting it was engaged by several Allied vehicles simultaneously, and the catastrophic ammunition explosion that destroyed the turret prevented detailed reconstruction of which specific hit proved fatal. The excavation also recovered personal effects, including Wittmann's Knight's Cross, which was returned to his widow, and the discovery provided closure for Hildegard Wittmann, who had spent 4 decades not knowing precisely where her husband was buried. The ethical questions about celebrating Wittmann's achievements, given his service in the Waffen-SS and Nazi Germany, reflect broader debates about how to assess military effectiveness separate from moral context. Wittmann wore SS uniform and fought for a criminal regime that committed genocide, yet his personal involvement in war crimes remains undocumented, and his combat actions at Villers-Bocage were militarily legitimate engagements against enemy soldiers. This creates difficult questions about whether military skill can be appreciated without implicitly endorsing the causes for which it was employed, and whether individuals deserve recognition for professional excellence when exercised in service of evil. The modern battlefield applications of lessons from Villers-Bocage include continued emphasis on surprise and aggression in armored combat, with doctrines like the U.S. Army's shock and awe concept owing intellectual debt to Wittmann's demonstration that violent rapid action can paralyze numerically superior forces. The principle that quality combined with tactical skill can defeat quantity remains relevant in current military planning despite technological advances that have changed specific capabilities, and Wittmann's action continues to be studied in armor schools worldwide as example of optimal heavy tank employment against lighter armored forces. The ultimate significance of Villers-Bocage transcends the specific tactical details to represent a broader truth about war, that individual actions can have strategic consequences despite the dominance of industrial mass and materiel in modern conflicts. Wittmann's 13 minutes of violence delayed British offensive operations by days and shaped Allied tactical approaches throughout the Normandy campaign, demonstrating that human factors, skill, judgment, aggression, leadership remained relevant variables in an era when outcomes seemed determined by force ratios and production statistics. This lesson that individuals and small units still mattered, despite the mechanization and industrialization of warfare, provided both inspiration and warning about the continued requirement for exceptional personnel, even in mass warfare contexts. The comparison between Villers-Bocage and modern armored combat reveals how technological changes have altered specific tactics while core principles remain constant. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams or Leopard 2 possess capabilities that would have seemed miraculous in 1944, including thermal imaging for night combat, computer-assisted fire control for first-round hits at extended ranges, and composite armor that provides protection against shape-charge weapons. Yet the fundamental principle demonstrated at Villers-Bocage, that a qualitatively superior platform employed with tactical skill can defeat numerically superior forces remains central to current armored doctrine. The difference is that modern technology has compressed the time and distance scales involved so that engagements that took minutes at hundreds of meters in 1944 now occur in seconds at thousands of meters. The post-war lives of Tiger 007's crew members who survived beyond Wittmann's death illustrate the varied fates that awaited German soldiers after Nazi Germany's defeat. Balthasar Wall survived the war and returned to civilian life working as a mechanic in Bavaria, and he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on rebuilding his life in the new democratic Germany. Wall died in 1996, having lived a quiet life far removed from the violence and glory of his youth, and his obituary mentioned his wartime service only briefly without details about his extraordinary gunnery achievements. This silence about military accomplishments was common among German veterans who struggled with guilt over their service to Nazism and who faced societal pressure to forget rather than commemorate their wartime roles. The evolution of British anti-tank tactics following Villers-Bocage extended beyond immediate equipment changes to include fundamental revisions in how armour engaged enemy tanks. The pre-Villers-Bocage British approach emphasised manoeuvre and exploitation, with armoured units pushing forward aggressively to break through enemy lines. But the demonstration that single German heavy tanks could annihilate entire formations forced adoption of more cautious tactics, where artillery and air support suppressed enemy positions before armour advanced. This tactical caution slowed offensive tempo but reduced casualties from ambushes by concealed German armour, representing the eternal military trade-off between speed and security. The British never fully resolved this tension and continued suffering tank casualties throughout the Normandy campaign despite tactical improvements. The technical comparison between the Tiger Wind that Wittmann commanded and later German heavy tanks like the King Tiger reveals the progression of armour technology during the war's final years. The King Tiger entered service in mid-1944, just months after Villers-Bocage, with even heavier armour up to 185 mm thick and an improved 88 mm gun with higher muzzle velocity. But these improvements came at cost of increased weight to 69 tons, that strained mechanical reliability and limited mobility. The question of whether Wittmann would have been even more effective in a King Tiger, or whether the Tiger I's better mobility suited his aggressive tactics, better remains debatable. But his death before King Tigers became widely available means we will never know how he would have employed the heavier vehicle. The memorial culture surrounding Villers-Bocage in modern France reflects complicated attitudes toward the battle that combine acknowledgement of historical significance with discomfort about commemorating German military success. The town maintains a small museum dedicated to the June 1944 fighting that presents balanced coverage of both British and German perspectives, and local authorities permit memorial services at German military cemeteries where Wittmann's crew members are buried. This approach recognizes that history cannot be erased while avoiding glorification of Nazi military achievements, representing post-war European efforts to remember the past without repeating its mistakes. The psychological research into combat stress, conducted after World War II, drew extensively on cases like the British survivors of Villers-Bocage to understand how sudden catastrophic violence affects military effectiveness. Studies found that soldiers who experienced surprise attacks producing mass casualties among their units showed higher rates of combat stress reactions and reduced effectiveness in subsequent engagements, compared to soldiers who experienced similar casualty levels in more predictable combat situations. This research contributed to modern understanding that unpredictability and lack of control produce more severe psychological trauma than simple exposure to danger, and influenced post-war military training that emphasizes stress inoculation and realistic combat scenarios to prepare soldiers for the shock of actual battle. The forgotten factor in Wittmann's success was the German military training system that produced highly skilled tank crews through intensive multi-year programs, emphasizing individual excellence and crew coordination. German tank commanders typically received 2 years of training, including several months of live-fire exercises before being considered combat-ready, compared to Allied training periods of 6 months or less that prioritized quantity over quality. This training differential meant that average German tank crews were significantly more skilled than average Allied crews even when equipment quality was comparable, and exceptional German crews like Wittmann's represented the peak of a training system that Allied nations never matched. The lesson that training quality matters as much as equipment quality influenced post-war military development, with modern professional armies emphasizing extended training periods over rapid mass mobilization. The final assessment of Michael Wittmann's place in military history must acknowledge both his extraordinary tactical achievements and the morally compromised context in which they occurred. He was unquestionably the most successful tank commander in history, with kill totals far exceeding any competitor, and his action at Villers-Bocage demonstrated battlefield brilliance that deserves study and appreciation as example of tactical excellence. Yet he fought for Nazi Germany wearing SS uniform, and his successes prolonged a war that killed millions and served a regime guilty of unprecedented crimes against humanity. This moral complexity means that Wittmann cannot be simply celebrated as hero, nor completely condemned as villain, but must be understood as complicated figure whose military skill was employed in service of evil cause. The lesson is that individual excellence and moral purpose are separate qualities that do not necessarily align, and that we must judge both military effectiveness and ethical context when assessing historical figures.